All right, so today we're diving deep into a story that you wanted to hear more about. It's about identity theft and a beauty pageant and, well, a whole bunch of legal questions. It's the Chidimma Adetshina case. She was a Miss South Africa contestant, and her citizenship has been under scrutiny for a while now. Essentially what happened is that she competed in the Miss South Africa pageant, and then things kind of took a turn. People began to question her heritage and whether or not she was actually allowed to be in the competition. And that's what sparked these investigations by the Department of Home Affairs. So some of the questions that we'll be trying to answer today are, did Adetshina actually know about this whole citizenship situation? What role did her parents play in all of this? And maybe the most important question, who is the real victim here? To help us unpack all of this, I've got an expert with me today.
Yeah, this is one of those cases that just seems so simple at first, but then it gets complicated so quickly it really makes you think about identity and immigration and the law in South Africa in a whole new way.
Okay, so let's unpack this a bit. So Adetshina originally claimed that she was South African because her mom was supposedly of Mozambican and Zulu descent. This seemed pretty reasonable at first, right? Then things went sideways.
Right, and to understand why this was such a big deal, we need to look at the rules of the Miss South Africa pageant. So contestants need to be South African citizens and embody South African culture. It's not enough to just have the passport, you know. You really have to represent the nation and its heritage.
Okay, so even though Adetshina talked about embracing South African culture, there were still questions about her background. That makes sense.
Exactly. And it's these inconsistencies in Adetshina's story that led the Department of Home Affairs to step in and question her citizenship.
Got it. And then in an interview, Adetshina kind of drops this truth bomb. She admits to being born in South Africa, but to Nigerian parents, and not to a mother with Mozambican and Zulu heritage like she originally claims. I mean, what a plot twist.
Yeah, this completely changed the direction of the investigation. It not only contradicts her previous claims about her mom's heritage, but it made the Department of Home Affairs even more suspicious.
I bet. Especially when they couldn't find any record of a Mozambican passport that Adetshina's mother supposedly used to enter South Africa. It's like trying to put together a puzzle where the pieces are all from different boxes.
Yeah, exactly. And this is where South Africa's Immigration Act, Note 13 of 2002, comes into play. This act very clearly states that to automatically qualify for South African citizenship by birth, at least one of your parents needs to be a South African citizen, or at least hold a permanent residency permit.
Which wasn't the case for Adetshina at all. This is crazy. So it turns out that someone else's identity was stolen, and then used to falsely register Adetshina as a South African citizen.
That's the part of the story that's just heartbreaking.
Absolutely. We need to remember that this is a real person whose life was deeply affected by this. This isn't just some sort of administrative error. This is someone potentially losing their ability to live a normal life, possibly for years. It's just hard to imagine what they must have gone through.
Yeah, and reports suggest that they couldn't register their own child or access basic government services. This is just a complete denial of their rights, and it all stems from someone else assuming their identity.
It's a complete violation. And it reminds us of how vulnerable we are in these systems.
Yeah, and what makes this even worse is that it seems like Adetshina and her family actually left South Africa. This makes it impossible for the authorities to fully investigate and hold them accountable.
Wait, so they just vanished? That adds a whole other layer to this story.
It does, and it raises some really serious questions about how this was even allowed to happen. How could someone just slip through the cracks like this? How much did the authorities know? It feels like we are left with way more questions than answers.
You're telling me. I feel like we've only just scratched the surface here. This is wild.
It really is. What's really concerning is that this went undetected for so long. We're talking like over 2 decades. That really points to some systemic issue with how South Africa verifies and enforces immigration laws.
I know it's almost unbelievable that something like this could go unnoticed for that long. This isn't just about Adetshina and her family anymore. It feels like we've stumbled upon a much bigger problem, potentially even corruption and widespread identity theft.
You're absolutely right. This is just one case, but it highlights a potential pattern. Several experts have suggested that South Africa's immigration system has loopholes that are being exploited to obtain these fake documents.
That's alarming. It's scary to think that this could be happening on a larger scale if these issues aren't addressed. I mean, what could this mean for South Africa in the long run?
Well, we take a step back and look at the bigger picture here. The potential consequences are pretty serious. Uncontrolled immigration and identity theft can weaken national security, put a strain on public resources, and even erode trust in the government.
That's a scary thought. It's like we're on a path that could lead to some pretty negative outcomes.
And then there's also the issue of fairness. It's just unjust that people who followed the proper immigration channels are at a disadvantage, while others are manipulating the system for their own gain. This creates resentment and can even lead to social tensions.
It's like a recipe for instability. It's interesting how this case has sparked so much debate. Some people blame Adetshina, others defend her and say she was a victim of her parents' actions. It's hard to know who to believe.
Well, it is important to remember that Adetshina was a minor when this happened, so it's hard to say how much she really knew or if she was actually involved in this alleged fraud.
That's true. But I keep coming back to the real victim in all of this, the South African, whose identity was stolen. I mean, what happened to them after all of this?
Their story is really the heart of this whole issue. It highlights just how devastating identity theft can really be. Reports say that they couldn't register their own child. They couldn't access government benefits or even open a bank account. It's like they became invisible to the system.
It's hard to imagine that kind of frustration and helplessness. And what about their child? Did they ever get the proper documentation?
Unfortunately, the sources don't go into detail about what ultimately happened to them. However, their case does highlight just how urgently South Africa needs to fix these issues and support victims of identity theft.
This is just infuriating. It feels like a betrayal of trust on so many levels.
It's definitely complex and emotional, but we have to be careful not to let this turn into something about xenophobia or generalizing about entire groups of people.
That's a really important point.
Yeah.
This is about holding individuals accountable, regardless of their nationality, and making sure that the system is fair for everyone.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that identity theft causes real harm. This isn't just a bureaucratic mess, It has devastating consequences for real people, denying them access to essential services and basic rights.
This has been a real eye-opener. We started with a Miss South Africa contestant and ended up uncovering this complex web of identity theft, immigration loopholes, and potentially even government corruption.
It shows just how one incident can reveal deeper societal issues that need to be addressed.
Yeah, it makes you think about the bigger picture. How can South Africa balance its commitment to human rights and welcoming refugees with the need to protect its own citizens?
That's the million-dollar question, and there's no easy answer. It requires a really thoughtful approach. That starts with acknowledging that there's a problem, strengthening institutions, and holding those who are responsible for these actions accountable.
We've seen firsthand how turning a blind eye can have really devastating consequences for individuals, and how it just erodes public trust. But it's not just about cracking down, right?
Absolutely not. It's also about fostering a culture of respect and understanding. We need to recognize the shared humanity of all individuals, regardless of where they come from or their immigration status. That's essential for building a just and cohesive society.
This has given me a lot to think about. It's a complex issue for sure, but understanding the facts and the human stories behind them is a good starting point.
Yeah, it's about going beyond the simple narratives and having these really constructive conversations that consider different viewpoints. We need to work towards solutions that are fair and equitable for everyone.
It sounds like this case has ignited a much larger debate about immigration in South Africa.
Yeah, what's interesting is how this single story has tacked into these larger societal anxieties.
We've seen a lot of strong opinions, with some people expressing real frustration over what they see as weak immigration enforcement.
And then there are those who are worried that this case is just going to fuel more xenophobia and discrimination against foreign nationals.
Yeah, that's a sensitive situation.
Yeah.
And the stakes feel incredibly high.
It's crucial to approach this issue with nuance and avoid making sweeping judgments.
Totally. We can't let fear and prejudice dictate how we respond to these challenges.
This case underscores the need for immigration policies that are both comprehensive and humane.
Policies that uphold the law while also respecting the dignity and rights of all individuals.
Finding that balance is always a challenge, but it's fundamental to creating a society that's both just and equitable.
This deep dive has really opened my eyes. We started with a beauty pageant and ended up exploring such complex themes of identity, belonging, and the challenges of living in a globalized world.
It's a stark reminder that individual actions can have these ripple effects, exposing systemic issues and sparking these important conversations.
And ultimately, it highlights how interconnected we all are, often in ways we don't even realize. Okay, so what does all of this mean for you, our listener? I mean, we've unpacked a lot here, but at the end of the day, it's really up to you to decide what resonates with you and how you want to think about all these issues.
Maybe this deep dive sparked your curiosity about South Africa's immigration policies, or even those in other countries.
Yeah, or maybe it made you think about your own experiences with identity and what it really means to belong.
Or maybe you're left with even more questions than answers. And that's okay too.
We always encourage you to keep exploring and questioning and digging deeper into these complexities of our world.
Remember, knowledge is power. And it's up to each and every one of us to use it wisely. And with compassion.
This case may have started with a beauty pageant, but its implications reach far beyond the stage.
It's a story about identity and belonging and the challenges we all face, as individuals and as a global community.
We've seen how one person's actions can have a ripple effect, exposing systemic issues and sparking these incredibly important conversations.
And it reminds us that we're all connected in ways we might not always realize.
That's it for this deep dive. Thanks for joining us. Until next time, keep those minds curious.